Hello and good morning and welcome to Leuphana University. I'm exceedingly pleased to have the opportunity to introduce you to the topic of sustainability, maybe also a little bit touching corporate sustainability. And I should also include some issues of competitiveness. I thought your discussion before was really interesting. And the issue of traumatization is a core issue, I think, with refugees. But we had a very similar situation actually in Germany and actually in large parts of Europe after the Second World War. And maybe one thing which helped society to overcome these big problems of having so many people being traumatized, one help was probably that everybody had to work very hard for survival at that moment. And I think it is absolutely crucial that refugees are included into the workforce and can start to work as early as possible so they can do something that makes sense, that they feel useful. Because not being useful, being treated as a patient is definitely not going to help to overcome such a situation. Well, this is just a very short comment on the discussion you had before. From my perspective, I would like to start here first with the question, why is there a desire for corporate sustainability or for sustainability at all? And the answer may be easy. There are lots of sustainability problems. You see some mentioned here. Yeah? There are lots more. Of course, the refugee issue and wars, etc. These are also sustainability problems. But we have further sustainability problems: poverty, hunger, climate change, loss of rainforests, biodiversity, etc. I think this generation and the coming generations face problems which humanity has not faced to that extent ever before. And this can be seen as a huge problem. It is a problem, but also as a huge opportunity and challenge for solving these problems and to engage. Rockström and colleagues, they have looked at the environmental sustainability issues, which is only one part of sustainability, but it is an important part of sustainability. And they ask themselves, how severe are these environmental sustainability problems? And they benchmark these problems with the so-called carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the ability of the globe to cope with certain problems. So how much CO2 can we emit, and the natural systems can cope with it. And what you see here is the green line with regard to various environmental sustainability problems like climate change or the acidification of oceans. And this green line, that's the carrying capacity. And you see for climate change, for nitrogen emissions, and for biodiversity, this carrying capacity has been exceeded substantially. For other problems, we're still far away from the carrying capacity, so these problems are not quite as severe, although the problems exist. Now, this can also be summed up to a certain extent, and you can ask yourself, how does it look like if we consider all environmental issues with regard to the carrying capacity of the world? And that is measured with the so-called Earth Day Overshoot Day, or the Earth Overshoot Day. So what day in the year have we basically used all our natural capacity which exists? Do you have an idea? May I ask you, what's your suggestion?
I don't have any clue.
No, don't get a guess. Who dares to make a guess? Yes.
I guess 1 month ago.
1 month ago. That's actually quite a good guess. It was the 13th of August. So the 13th of August, we've basically used up all the natural resources and capacities which the Earth, or the natural systems of the Earth provide, and we've used that already up. In the year 2000, it was the 21st of November. In 1987, it was the 19th of December. So in other words, we're using more and more of our capacity, and therefore the problems are getting more and more severe. Now, we have similar situations with lots of social issues. We also have areas where we have made progress, where things are getting better in the environmental and in the social area. But what I want to show you with this is there is a certain urgency, there's a certain real need to change something. Okay, so we use at the moment nearly 2 planets with regard to the natural resources. What kind of change do we need? We obviously need a change. We can't continue the way we do. Is a revolution the solution? Well, very often you hear that. We need revolutionary new concepts, new approaches. We need a revolution that changes everything. And if you look at revolutions, you have here the French Revolution and you have the Soviet, the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and you look at the results, you had a certain destruction, you had wars. Things did not necessarily all get better, at least not fast. If you look at the environmental pollution, if you look at the social situation of the Soviet Union, which it created, then this is not necessarily the way to go forward. So in other words, taking the term seriously, revolution, I would say we don't necessarily need a revolution, we rather need a transformation. So change should be a transformation into new ways of doing business, new ways of the economy, and new ways of acting in our society. Transformation is a development process. So how can that be achieved? One very popular solution to this question is central planning. We need somebody who organizes this for us. We need a global government which says what we're allowed to do and what we shouldn't do, and which governs. Now, central planning, and I just want to show you in a very sketchy manner, has a lot of problems. The central planning of today's day, for instance, was that I received 3 mails with nearly, but not exactly, the same information. The first information was how to get from the airport to Leuphana University. And as I'm already a member of the university, it obviously was not very useful information. And how to get to university via the motorway. The Soviet Union and its satellite states like the German Democratic Republic did not create a cleaner economy. It created less welfare for its citizens, and it collapsed. If you look at armies which are centrally planned and centrally organized, they have more and more problems. Why did Germany not succeed in Afghanistan? Because wars work a different way nowadays in guerrilla strategies. So they're not successful anymore, these central planned systems. The national health in the United Kingdom, which is a centrally planned, and actually in Germany we have to a certain extent a very similar situation. It's a centrally planned system. It's for free. You could say that's a great thing, and it's centrally planned, and everybody has equal access. But the problem is there that for some people, even vital services, like getting a life-saving operation, cannot be organized before they would be dead. So in other words, they have to go to other countries and to have to pay everything themselves in order to get the treatment which saves their life. These are just some examples which basically show that an eco-sustainability dictatorship is an illusion and would probably rather cause lots of problems and nonsense than create good solutions. So the question is, what could be the way forward if we can't do it centrally planned? Can competition help? to develop good solutions. Is that an approach? And basically the market system is very much based on competitiveness and competition. Well, what is a competition? Actually, this should be animated, but what you see here, a war is not a competition. Very often comparisons are made when we talk about competition, well, that's like war. But war is something completely different than competition, so they're completely different rules. Now, this is a competition here. You see those are runners trying to be the first, and so therefore you also have losers. Now, is that an approach which could create sustainability solutions, that we have winners and losers? Well, let's leave this question for a moment. Definitely what's not competition is to cheat. So competition has certain rules. For instance, in sports, not to use doping. Or here, that is, you found that on the internet, on the Volkswagen emissions fraud situation. It says, meanwhile, at Volkswagen's emission test center, and you see it's a lot of black smoke, that's another pass. So they went through. Okay, they're making a joke of this situation, but cheating is obviously not competition or outside of competition. And competition does not always have to have winners and losers. Look at, for instance, Berlin Marathon, which was a little more than a week ago. There were 10,000 of people running. Did they all think they would win the marathon? Probably most didn't. And they never had the goal. So what goals did they have? Maybe just to pass the finishing line, to pass the finishing line in a certain time, to be part of a huge event. So in other words, competitions do not necessarily have to have winners and losers. Competitions can also just be settings with certain rules, and there you try to achieve something, and you can also try to achieve it together. What does that mean? That means that competition makes sense if we design it in the right way and if we stay in certain rules. Here you see sustainability reports of a couple of companies, including, for instance, Volkswagen, and you see that these companies have all faced huge environmental problems. You see here BP, that's the Deepwater Horizon problem, Gulf of Mexico, Shell, a couple of years before, the North Sea dumping an oil platform, or here you have the Volkswagen case. They all had excellent sustainability reports. They even got awards for their sustainability reports. So competition for the wrong thing, in this case just for communication with sustainability reports, does not provide a solution either. Well, does competition for who is the most benevolent company or manager, who spends most of his or her profits and earnings to society, does that provide a solution and help? I would say no, this also doesn't help to solve any problems, because if you imagine a company that produces landmines here, and then afterwards creates a foundation and gives money to people whose legs were bombed off to help them, then this obviously is not sustainable. So in other words, and this is of course an extreme case, but what it shows is that it's not important how much of your profits you give to somebody. It's not important how your philanthropic activities look like, but what is important is that the rules are clear and that you focus on a goal that makes sense. And the goal that makes sense with regard to sustainability is the question, who can create value for society and who can solve sustainability problems? Who has the best idea to create a real solution, not a sustainability report, not give money to somebody, but at the same time in the core business produce things which harm and which contribute to an unsustainable world. So the difference between philanthropy and corporate sustainability is, for instance, the question of philanthropy is how and to whom do you distribute your profits? Whereas corporate sustainability asks the question, how and for whom do you create value by solving a sustainability problem? So in other words, what we need is more competition in the right area. We need a fundamental sustainability transformation which focuses on creating value in a sustainable manner. And I'll give you an example. If you take climate change as one of the big sustainability problems which I've mentioned before, then you can, for instance, say, okay, mobility and cars, etc., they cause, obviously, emissions and contribute to climate change. So emissions-free individual mobility would be the typical technical answer. That's what we need. And then the question would be, do we need a 1-liter car? Do we need an electric car? What could be the solution to it? So you would have here, I call them suburban tanks. You have these cars, and the question is whether these cars, electric cars or 1-liter cars, whether they could be the solution to it. Now, if you go further than just asking the technical question and ask yourself what kind of needs are behind mobility actually, and how can these needs be fulfilled in a way which is emission-free or has very low emissions, then you will come up with different solutions, and these solutions will, for instance, be car sharing. Okay, so how can we, with less cars, produce a service for individual mobility? And you see here examples. For instance, Car2Go. You see that this is supported with apps. And you see here in the public sphere specifically designed or designated parking space for car sharers. If we take that as a solution which goes near and towards creating sustainable development for individual mobility, then we can analyze this from the question, how does competition and how does collaboration help to solve it? First of all, competition. It was the idea of students, so-called ride sharing, to use a car with several people. So it was a university. There were universities starting with this idea. They created an entrepreneurial startup, and this was a competition to existing car companies selling cars. So it was competition to the existing business model in the car industry. And that has created a market in Germany of about 100,000 users. Then this was taken up, this competitive pressure was taken up by large companies like Daimler and BMW, and they reacted by establishing and innovating and introducing free-floating car sharing concept, where the cars just stand somewhere in the city, in Berlin, for instance, or in Hamburg, and you can just pick up the car if you're a member of that car sharing company. You get in and you drive wherever you want to in that urban area, and you just leave the car where you want to. That has led to a market of more than 2.5 million users in Germany. So the market has increased through the competitive pressure. But there is also collaboration involved. If you look at the free-floating concept, it's based on the collaboration of software providers, car manufacturers like Daimler, for instance, cities, which designate specific parking spaces for car sharing, particularly rental companies. If you have to use a car just outside the urban area and go somewhere else, then you're connected to the respective rental car organization. So in other words, that's what we called co-petition. You have a collaboration of various actors, from society, business actors, economic and political actors, which are in a competitive setting and therefore create sustainability solutions. Transformation is mostly something which cannot be achieved immediately. So give up the idea of a revolution. It cannot be centrally planned. That doesn't work. You will not get good solutions. It requires a development process, and a development process requires that different actors are engaged, are involved, and at the same time that there is a certain competition, a certain pressure, and also incentive to be better with regard to providing solutions. So competition among companies as well as collaborations between companies and societal actors is the way where at the moment the big innovations with regard to sustainability are being developed. Thank you very much.
So my task is, although I recognize that Stefan is not fully surfing on the competition part of the economy, but already made a little leap towards cooperation. So my task is to present a different story. Yeah? So the story would be, if we imagine how an economic system could be designed, why not vote for cooperation instead of competition? Or to put it in a broader sense, we may ask, how should a capitalist system be designed? Yeah? So this is a little bit my task. Before we do so, we can identify quite interesting pockets of experience and practices that obviously do not fit very well with the traditional understanding of a pure market-driven competitive economy. We have this term, whatever that means, we may investigate this a little bit later, the sharing economy, with couch surfing. I mean, who used couch surfing? Is there anybody who used? Yes? Yeah. You enjoyed it? Yeah. So then Airbnb. Although Airbnb, we come back to this perhaps a little bit later, of course is a real business, but it does use some principles of a cooperative economy. Then we have very different types of governing mechanisms of firms. Migros, for those of you who come from Switzerland, is there anybody who comes from Switzerland? No? Yes, you do. You do certainly know Migros, yeah? Or for the Germans, we may think about like Edeka, Rewe, Coop. So there are different types of organizations that are, we could say in a broader sense, worker-owned. So they're not designed as regular publicly traded corporations, but rather as worker-owned corporations. While this may sound a very socialistic, this actually became a common practice for professional service firms, the knowledge-intensive firms that basically have nothing else to sell than their expertise. Like one of the most profitable law firms in the United States is Wachtel, Lipton, Rosen and Katz, and they are designed as a partnership. And the key feature of a partnership is that partners are owners of the firm and at the same time, they're managers of the firm. And this solves some interesting principal-agent problem. And then we have some interesting external relations. So firms are trying to embed themselves increasingly not only in arm's length relationships, but rather try to develop some kind of partnership relationships, network relationships with externals. Interesting case that became the topic in the 1980s were the keiretsu structures in the Japanese economy, where companies like Toyota develop long-term relationships with their suppliers and distributors. But if we think about digitalization, then we also find interesting models with Wikipedia, with Linux and open source that obviously develop very different types of work relations. We may call these work relations that are based on mutual help, mutual support, instead of conflict-intensive social relations. So this may help a little bit to get a picture. before we move into these different segments, I think it is important to understand that we may apply very different types of economic governing regimes. And they all have, of course, certain pros and cons. And I would like to move you through a little bit. So the first one is the classical, like, competitive capitalist regime. If we think about United States, is probably the country that probably moves closer to this type of, like, archetype. And the underlying logic, of course, is that the market is the primary force, and the role of the government is really to ensure that the market works on the one hand side, but should also engage in deregulation. If we move closer to either China or potentially France, that may come a little closer to state-controlled capitalism, especially in China, then, like, orchestrating the competition within state-owned firms or regulating these firms becomes like a primary interest. Then we have the version of Scandinavian capitalism, although Scandinavian capitalism in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark has been deregulated over the last years, but that has been an important topic. Here the underlying motto is basically not so much to change the way how companies should operate and markets should operate, but rather to engage in a redistribution of wealth, and therefore softening some of the destructive effects of market forces. And something I would like to engage a little bit later with is how could we envision something that we may call cooperative competition and cooperative economy. And in fact, there's no real country we can easily refer to. And this is why I said there are some pockets of experience and practices that may come closer to this type of cooperative economy. So let's start a little bit with the first one. So we have to know a little bit our enemies, at least for the discussion right now. Yeah? So competitive capitalism. So I think there's no doubt that competitive capitalism has provided great achievements. The pricing mechanism is certainly, under certain conditions, an effective mechanism for resource allocation. It certainly encourages personal initiative and responsibility. And competition, as Stefan was pointing out, is an important mechanism to keep people on their toes. Because without competition, then the question is, why do we actually have to improve? Then we may simply go back and stay in our belief community. There's no reason to excel. So these are, like, important and good features of market forces. And of course, competition certainly helps because it produces a whole variety of different products and services. You may not remember, but while we still had a monopoly in the telecommunication industry, so basically the whole country had one type of telephone, or maybe two or three different types. Yeah? I still remember we still have this gray telephone in the basement. Yeah? So the whole country had one gray telephone. And with opening up competition, a whole different variety of different products and services were produced, which obviously didn't work under a lack of competition. So these are important features. But of course, my task is more to look for some problematic associations. And therefore, I would like to point out a couple of deficiencies of the market forces. Perhaps the first deficiency, and this is well discussed in economics, the market has technical deficiencies, especially market failures. The market mechanism does not always work. Perhaps the Volkswagen case gives a little illustration. Obviously, pollution then is not calculated in the pricing mechanism. And that, of course, creates, in many cases, non-sustainable products or services. The second important thing is the market mechanism, and competitive capitalism fosters a specific type of consumer behavior we may call consumerism. I'm not quite sure if you would position yourself as a consumerist, yeah? But the underlying objective is to bring as many products to the market and services. And you don't have to think about whether it's really important in terms of sustainability, but rather the underlying goal is to reach economic growth. And therefore, the tandem are a couple of junk innovations, as I would call them. And the market mechanism has not been very effective in really spotting these junk innovations and selecting these junk innovations. And therefore, in many cases, it rather encourages consuming junk innovations instead of hindering them. And of course, there's a more problematic issue on the global scale, because competitive capitalism has also become like a strong force of what we may call neo-colonialism, because it basically has not prevented a couple of countries, European, North American countries, and of course increasingly China, to exploit the rest of the world, especially for natural resources. And you can imagine that this certainly creates conflicts in addressing some of the interesting and relevant sustainability issues we are facing. So this is a little bit, I guess, the gloomy story of competitive capitalism. Now let's move to a different perspective, and I think it's very sketchy because we don't have a very clear empirical case we can refer to. Cooperative capitalism. So how can we imagine a different case, cooperative capitalism? I think there are probably three main principles that also run through the literature on which cooperative capitalism is based. The first one is cooperative ownership. So the sharing of ownership with those who basically produce the fruits of their work. So a little bit as we can see it with the partnership model in professional services, the same of course with the cooperatives we can find in many areas, whether this is in the case of farming, whether this is in the case of retail industry, or in the case of knowledge-intensive industry. Then the second case, and this is quite interesting, when you talk with economists, then the picture for economists is that basically the economic world is full of market relations, and then there's some organizations that obviously produce products and services. So the market relation perspective is very dominant. So if a person from Mars would picture the Earth, it would be represented by a network of market relations from the perspective of an economist. As Nobel laureate Herbert Simon once said, he found this as a very strange perspective because most of our life, we basically work and live in organizations of some kind. Whether we work in these organizations, whether our children are in kindergarten, which is also an organization, whether we may engage in some kind of social enterprise, whether we work in a sports club. So most of our time, we actually work and spend time in organizations. So he basically flip-flopped the perspective and then said, so we have to think about how do we improve organizations and not only thinking about how do we improve markets. Yeah? And then part of the story that we can certainly learn from partnership organizations is that they have a very different type of management, more what we may call self-management, self-organization teams, and so forth. That certainly fosters much stronger participation than we will find in a typical McDonaldized hierarchical organization. And then a third important element of cooperative capitalism is stakeholder negotiation. In contrast to the typical Fordistic idea of having arm's length relationship with our suppliers or with our distributors and with our customers, the thing becomes more complex. because whatever we try to do is something that we would like to embed into a network of different stakeholders, whether this are you as a customer, whether these are public communities, whether this is a state. And this is something we basically have to negotiate. So this is the underlying idea. Collaboration plays a very important role within the firm and then across the firm. And as we also know from the biotechnology industry, the large biotech firms are in principle incapable of producing the necessary innovations by themselves, but they rather embed themselves in networks of innovation with small and medium-sized innovative firms. And in many cases, these were startups from large universities. So, why does cooperative capitalism potentially makes a difference? I think the first one is it rather tries to implement a give and take system. It's based on reciprocity, which basically means, and this is what we can see with some of the initiatives, with Airbnb. Airbnb is based on a cooperative or reciprocal system. Because obviously, if you misbehave as a consumer, then you will get pretty bad ratings. Yeah? If you get pretty bad ratings, then the next landlord is not very much willing to rent out his or her flat to you. Yeah? So reciprocity certainly is an important thing. A second, I think, interesting question that fosters the idea of reciprocity is the discussion we have right now about public value. A colleague, Timo Meinhardt, developed a kind of like public value scorecard. And I think the underlying logic is the companies should not be only concerned with to create shareholder values, to provide profit for their shareholders, but they should also raise the question in how far the corporation, with its products and services, actually contributes to the public well-being. So he developed a public value scorecard for Switzerland in October 30th. I think there will be an article about the German public value scorecard. So this is an interesting issue because it raises the question in how far do companies really contribute towards the bigger well-being of society. Second important thing is how do we manage organizations? Do we manage organizations as hierarchical entities where we basically demand strong obedience by you, yeah, whatever the CEO has to say? No. As the case of open source software development and Linux illustrates very well, if leaders are not capable in stimulating their workers are pretty much free to find a new leader. That works, of course, very well in the internet in self-organizing teams. It may not work very well in physical organizations, but the underlying logic is very different. So we are trying to foster a kind of like collective entrepreneurship, not only like an individual entrepreneurship, but fostering collective entrepreneurship within firms. And that, of course, increasingly becomes a topic even for large corporations. I think we take the case of Henkel. They have the factor 3, I think, was the project called to produce 3 times the value with the same ecological footprint. Right now, it's a goal by 2030. But this goal, and especially if the company is increasingly perceived as a sustainable company, then you have to contribute towards this goal. You can't basically say, in 2030, I'm sorry, yeah? It didn't work. Yeah? So then your overall mission as a sustainable company evaporates. And a third interesting issue, cooperative capitalism may contribute towards equal opportunities. So a society which is strongly segregated, with few that are very rich and many that are very poor, doesn't seem to be a very sustainable society. Yeah? Rather, it creates class conflicts and perhaps a revolution, as Stefan was pointing out. And it's quite interesting if we take the case of the American dream. The American dream is, do you remember the American dream? Yeah, what's the American dream?
Where from dishwasher to millionaire?
Yes, from dishwasher to millionaire. And this American dream is still like hammered into the brains of Americans through the media. But in fact, it's a myth. It's not true. Not true anymore. It may have been true in the 1930s and 1940s, but it's not true anymore. Because class mobility is worse than in France, in the United States. So it's close to the United Kingdom that traditionally was considered as a class-based society. Yeah? But I think this is important if you want to create a sustainable society, that those that are willing to contribute, those that are skilled, have a chance to move up. And those that are not willing to contribute also have a chance to move down in society. Yeah? So Denmark is a very positive example, and Peru a rather bad example where you have a very clear class structure. So, last but not least, so does cooperative economy, cooperative capitalism then help? I think there are a couple of like important grains of truth that you may take throughout your study and think about. It's a very different type of economic system, but it may not be enough. Because if you want to tackle many of these issues that Stefan was pointing out, it's not just a task for redesigning economic system, because we also have to redesign education, we have to redesign politics that would basically support this type of economic system. And in the end, the problem is we have to face a whole array of different problems, economic, political, cultural, environmental issues. And in fact, cooperative capitalism is silent on a number of issues that are quite important for us. Yeah? The problem of coordination and size. As you may imagine, cooperatives may not work very well when we have a multinational corporation with 600,000 employees. Yeah? Not quite clear if we take the case of Volkswagen. And it's basically silent, which is important, on how do we develop public goods, security, health, education, science, defense, and so forth. So these are some of the issues where we still have to find answers.